And, you know, you hear about the apple a day, keeps the doctor away. Well, recently, like within the last year and a half, there is a study published on what is in an apple core. And it has a power pack of probiotics and prebiotics that is combined in no other fruit or food. I do, because most of the food we get is either pesticide or sprayed, and not all organic food is actually spray-free, because they can do. Okay, this is. So I was listening to them discuss about the fact that we now have things like Culturelle and all these other kinds of probiotics that they market so that you can put good bacteria back in. And the prebiotics, which are the nutritional source for the good bacteria in our bodies to eat so that they thrive, and the bad bacteria don't actually get to grow, and so they kind of muscle them out of the way. Well, the amount that they put in two capsules, which costs you about $1 a capsule, is actually in eating the apple core. So my grandmother was right. You need to eat the apple core with your apple. And if you're eating the apple, when you eat an apple seed, the arsenic in there is actually packaged and you'll pee it out. So even though there's a minuscule amount of arsenic and your body actually uses arsenic for some metabolic reactions, that it will actually, eating the whole fruit actually is, an intact fruit is a healthy way to eat it, and you get all of what's there, including some of the funky micronutrients in the skin of the apple. Yes, ma'am. You can eat apple seeds if you're eating the apple with them, because they do have some level of arsenic, and there's some other things in there that are probably not to just go chow down on apple seeds. Okay, they're a little bitter. I do not eat the stem. It's bad for my teeth work, right? Okay, so here's a good one. Who eats apple cider vinegar? Are you meat eaters? No. Okay, so here's the big deal about vinegar, in particular apple cider vinegar. It is a preservative, and it actually can, like formaldehyde, have the same impact on your stomach mucosal lining cells. When you swallow it, you actually get an acid burn in your esophagus. So if you have acid reflux, although we say you don't make your acid reflux worse, and that's because when the acid goes down, your stomach recognizes it's acid, and it closes the sphincter between your esophagus and your stomach really tight, because there's a lot of acid there. It is an acid, and it is a preservative, and it actually will pickle, just like it pickles a cucumber. It will pickle your stomach if you're taking it every day. If well, we have a couple comments in there. Vinegar is a preservative for food, so if you were preserving cucumbers, because that was the way you had to preserve a cucumber to be able to eat it, you actually have some nutritive value left in that food product. So the key about acid is, if you are eating a meat diet, if you are eating milk, if you are eating cheese, then taking vinegar actually does help your digestion, because you've got a lot of acids that your stomach has trouble processing. And if you are one of the partakers of the alkaline water fad that goes around, then vinegar moves the alkaline process back to where your stomach likes to sit. Your stomach will natively sit at a pH of 4.5 to 5.5 pH. Water is 6.5 to 7.1 around this area. So those are health nuggets. Trivia points, like I said.
So what if you use the vinegar to gargle when you have like a
Sore throat?
or something like that?
You're killing bacteria and whatever else is in there. You can do it. If you're not ingesting a big amount, and here's the key about a lot of foods. If you're not doing something consistently every day, you're not doing a huge amount of it, then your body's built to balance out, to keep itself in balance. That's how God built us. And even though we have almost 6,000 years of decay, our bodies are still keeping as much balance as they can. So one last trivial pursuit. I think we're just about got everybody here who's going to stay. How far does sneeze droplets travel when you go achoo? Somebody's got 6 fingers, 6 feet. 95% will stay because water is actually heavy and the air has a lot of particulate matter in it now. And if it hits that, it will actually go to the ground farther. So 6 feet is what we're telling people with the new wave of the viruses going around. And wearing a mask, does that help?
Only if you don't keep touching the mask. If you keep touching the mask, then you got it on your hands.
Well, the key with that is also if you're next to somebody who's sneezing, you're covered with sneeze. So it's all of you that needs to be contaminated. If you are trying to protect your neighbor from your own cold, then a mask works really well. In the operating room, we wear masks to protect the droplets from our talking not getting into a wound, because there's streptococcus, and that used to be a huge problem for wound management. Okay? And now there's Mrsa. Mrsa's everywhere. And there's vancomycin resistant stuff and multi-drug resistant stuff, and it goes on and on. So one last health myth here. Do you feed a fever or feed a cold or starve a cold or starve a fever? That is the saying. Is it true? My mom was smarter than your mom. Actually, we are given guidance that what you're trying to do when you're ill is to eat very small amounts and drink lots. So you're actually trying to drown an illness, not actually trying to feed it. Now, people who have been recovering and they are starting to be hungry, you definitely want to feed them some foods that they can get a lot of the nutritional value out of rather quickly, which is things like oatmeal and applesauce and bananas and fruit. Although we don't think about them being very digestible, they really are. Most of our fruits are absorbed and used without a lot of extra work in your gut. So as Ellen White says, diet is a process. It's a never-ending journey into the future. I didn't know she made so many comments about the future before, but apparently that's one of them. So, shall we start with prayer? Dear Father, we ask for your blessing for this time that we spend learning a little bit more about the information that you have made available to us, about the times in which we live, and to prepare for your soon coming. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so the topic today was called clean air. Who thinks we live in a clean air world now? Yeah, it's one of those things. Let's see, gotta move this twice. Okay, I'll move over. Is that better? Okay. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. God made an atmosphere that we actually can divide now into 6 different layers, where we study and research them all, and we tend to live in the bottom layer, okay? When he uttereth his voice, there is a multitude of waters in the heavens, and he causeth the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He maketh lightnings with rain, and bringeth forth a wind out of his treasures. Jeremiah is describing what God is doing in the atmosphere. He describes the multiple vapors. Do you know there are rivers of currents in the air? We talk about the jet stream. We talk about the El Nino, the La Nina. But there are rivers, both in our oceans and in the atmosphere. And the rivers are shearing because they're not always going the same direction. And when we have a storm, there's a lot of interacting and shearing, which actually is where the pressure point for our lightnings come. And our rain, which is something God did after the flood, well, actually officially it was before the flood, was something that he brought out of his treasure house. Job also talks about the rain being stored. He also talks about the snow being stored in the mountains. Which alone spreadeth out the heavens, he's talking about God, and treads on the waves of the sea. When Jesus stood up in the boat and he told the wind to be peace, be still, he was spreading out the heavens because he was chasing away the clouds. Ellen White describes it as the clouds just rolled away and they were left with a beautiful sparkling sky that was really clean. And of course we all know Jesus walked on the waves of the sea. Isaiah says, "It is he that sits upon the circle of the earth." Anybody have a doubt that the earth is round? "And the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in." We have a bubble, a balloon around us. That is where we live. That the air and the gases are mixed just right for us to be able to live and breathe and thrive. And God, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, who walks on the wings of the wind. We have a lot to be thankful for the way God made this, because he made it for our pleasure, our enjoyment, our health, our longevity. After Adam and Eve sinned, the earth was cursed. The atmosphere, once so mild and uniform in temperature, was now subject to marked changes, and the Lord mercifully provided them with a garment of skins as protection from the extremes of heat and cold. So was it just the earth that was cursed? The ground was cursed, very specifically. But now, this is actually before the flood. God is giving them garments, not only as a symbol of his giving us his righteousness, but also protecting them from the elements that was now coming. Because not only people lost their covering of light, the earth lost its covering of light. We know that from some of the studies about timing that we do from our rocks and our atmosphere. And the creationists who go back and look at the dates about why we say rocks are billions of years old, and you link it to data that says the shells on top of the Himalaya mountains are only 4,000 years old, but the rock has pollution on it from just recently too, if they line all those dates and studies up, you can see that there's a transition there. And it isn't at 4,000 years. It isn't with just the flood. It actually goes back to where we think Earth was created some 6,000 odd years ago. And there's a shift there in dating, and there's a shift there in the composition of gases that they find that are trapped in different rocks and materials. Hence, the argument. If I look online for arguments on rocks and gases and stuff, I can find anything from A to Z. Whichever opinion I want to hold, I can find proof for it. Proof, evidence, evidence. But we know that we have here that there were extremes of heat and cold. This is before the axis of the Earth was tilted with the flood. This is before the 360 days moved to a year of 364 days. This is before that happened. So the Earth lost its protective covering. And if you think about it, people in outside universes, beings in outside universes, because we no longer have a covering, can see what's happening here. And we're told that, which is an interesting way to look at life here. I have some trouble sometimes imagining what the Earth as it's in its clean native state would have been. But then as I was thinking about it, my childhood memories of the Earth, and they're not that far away, the Earth was much cleaner then than it is now. It is amazing what has happened in my short lifetime. Used to be able to smell a rainstorm coming when the wind was bringing it, and it smelled clean. You could smell different trees that were in bloom, or the farmer's field that had corn that was in bloom as the rain would come through, and then it would wash all those smells away, and you would have a very unique smell for rain. The rain in Ohio does not smell like the rain in Oregon, and it doesn't smell like the rain here in Florida. And when I'm outside after a hurricane and the rain and the winds have gone through and we have these beautiful dry blue skies after the hurricane goes through, that light feeling of the air is familiar to me from when I lived in Ohio. But most of the time, our air is quite heavy here. And it's not just heavy from pollution. It actually seems to be heavy with particulate matters and other things in it. When I grew up, you could see a thunderstorm coming, and it could actually turn the entire sky around us green. But if you're in Arizona, the sky actually can be purple. And if you're in Washington and you're looking out at the ocean, it actually can be yellow. So there are micro niches of our atmosphere that are more than just simple 6 layers stacked on one on top of each other. And we talk about the pressures and the gradients and why we can fly outside of our orbit to go to the moon. But inside our Earth, there are patterns, and the air is always moving. So it is always being stirred. I had a cherry tree in my backyard, and if I would walk underneath it when the cherries were setting, I would smell, and the blooms had passed, so it no longer smelled like the cherry blooms. But I kept walking and checking every day, because when the first fruit started to be ripe, because I wanted it before the birds got to it, I discovered that that tree had a unique smell to it, and it would change. There would be an odor difference. And you could tell when the tree was mostly ripe by the smell, because then it started getting too sweet. So you knew where the point to start to harvest the cherries out of the tree was. My mother grew up in Canada, and we lived in Ohio, and she would sniff the air and say, "It's going to snow next week." And I would look at her and say, "Well, that's not what the weatherman says." course, the weatherman now are supposed to be better. But she said, no, 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 it's going to snow next week. I can smell Canada. I'm like, no, you cannot smell Canada. We're in Ohio. It's miles away. Well, I think she's right. There's a smell to that polar vortex, even when it trundles all the way down through Florida. There's a smell to a cold air that comes through. And this is all after sin. This is all something that is now happening. Who knows the smell of grass when you go out and you mow the lawn, and it's a heavy smell. It hangs down to the ground, actually, in Florida. But now when you smell grass, I can smell Roundup. I can smell the dyes that some of my neighbors put on their grasses. I can smell the weeds, mostly around my place when I'm mowing. I smell the weeds. I don't smell the grass too much anymore. If you were to take soil out of the ground and look at the sand layer on top, and then look at the dark red layer underneath that has more iron and copper in it, they actually have a different smell to them. These are all things that if you're paying attention and trying to be observant, that they're there. And we just have not trained ourselves to look at these things. But this is part of what a farmer does. When a farmer studies things, he can pick up a ground and he'll feel the soil and rub it through his fingers. But he's also smelling the soil. And there are people who actually, if you have not put a lot of chemicals in the soil, some of our organic and back to Eden farmers can actually tell if they need to add a certain amount of nitrogen back to the soil because it has a different smell. Most likely because the bacteria don't have enough food to make the odor that they're off-gassing, but it is a very real thing. People can tell. So, what do we have now? I think everybody knows what the smell of Roundup and our spraying, and you know, it's just not pesticides anymore. We even use ground up plants now that we concentrate to 1,000 times. We grind up chrysanthemum blooms and their stems and then use them as a spray for organic farming for pest control. There are some organic farmers who actually use flowers woven in between their crops, and this is actually one of the ways to trap pests that you don't want in certain areas, so that you actually have less of a need for spraying. And who knows about the dark red streak there? Anybody seen that? Anybody heard of the red tide? What does it smell like? Can you smell it from miles away from the coast when it's there? And if we have standing stagnant water, which we have a lot of standing water in Florida, there's a smell to that. These are not things that God put there, obviously, and they're signs of what we're told of the earth wearing away like a garment, because its protective mechanisms for keeping it in balance have been dinged, and it's no longer able to keep up with what we're doing to it. So, turning to what air pollution is, our impact on air pollution on health. We know, and it is defined by the World Health Organization, that chronic exposure to air pollution is deadly. And that is their official statement. And they have tables and tables of data where they have measured levels, and they have defined for different areas of the world these different levels. And so China, for instance, has a different numerical range of what they call polluted air than, say, Los Angeles. And the World Health Organization has all these huge maps that they keep this all track of. Well, one of their important things that they've been filtering with all this data that we've been collecting in the last 50 years is trying to track trends. So they looked at a fairly resilient age of human lifespan, a 12-year-old. And a 12-year-old is at that point of growth where they're no longer a kid, they're starting to become an adult. They have a very turned-on metabolism. Their brain is still growing fairly rapidly. And they study that group in population studies and then connected those population studies to pollution indexes. And this study came out of LA. And they tracked that these 12-year-olds in times of high pollution or who live right along an area where there's a lot of highway traffic have increased risks for anxiety and depression. And it's almost 26%. That's a lot for a 12-year-old who's fairly resilient and still believes that anything is possible. In the medical morbidity and review data, they actually did whole state population studies and compared them to city studies, and were tracking ER visits. And ER visits, suicide attempts, depression, and anxiety follow the exact same curves of the pollution indexes for that area. So we know that as air pollution goes up, the impact on people is actually really there. They don't have the same amount of oxygen. Their balance of the gases that they're breathing is not the same. Your lungs, actually living in LA next to a highway, look pretty much like a 10-year pack smoker. Not so good. We want pink lungs, but our lungs aren't pink anymore. Yeah, I'll take it. Somewhere. So other studies show air pollution bothers us from head to toe. It is tracked directly to dementia, to heart disease, lung disease, stroke, fertility problems. That was just in 2018. Reduced intelligence, 2018. That actually comes from China. And that was a study that had most of the students that they were studying were those born in Beijing. So this is a captured audience that they had that they're able to study, and they are tracking their IQ rates diminishing the longer their time in one particular area they spend, the more an impact on their IQ it has. So if you take your classroom of students out to the mountains for the summer and then bring them back, they still, compared to the kid living out in the mountaintop, have a less IQ, but it's impacted less than somebody who never gets out. And this was actually being used to try and get them to fund more public health efforts. So basically, this all boils down to that the research is showing our world is sadder and it is angrier. And you think this is a mistake? This is Satan on purpose. He is setting up the world to kill us all, because that is his plan, is it not? I mean, the end of the world is coming, and we need to be more cognizant of some of the tools that he's using. So when you're out in a crowd of people and you're trying to be a smiley face of a witness, just remember that person is starting out angry, and they're not angry at you. They're angry at everything. So it takes a little bit of a slice of an extra effort for you to remember that they're starting from a bad place now. They don't have the benefits that we had just 50 years ago from clean air, from having a de-stressed life, from not being angry about the way you're being treated. So they were arguing. My daughter is a scientist. She says I needed more science in here. So Zhang et al. In Nature Human Behavior, they did a study to prove that their data that they were collecting in a university study was equivalent to the millennial generation by looking at social media. which they have access to. And they tracked a happiness scale that they designed and showed that it tracks absolutely on track with the level of pollution indexing. So as it goes up in the city, happiness goes down. As the pollution gets cleared off by the atmospheric conditions changing, then happiness goes up. It's a rather interesting study. I don't know what we get out of it here in this country, but I don't imagine it'd be that much different. So what makes our air dirty? We have fire and industry and oil and natural things called atmospheric inversion. We have currents and pressures that are changing. Over our cities, would anybody realize that Bakersfield, California is one of the most highest air pollution tract index in the country? You would, yeah. It has, because of its setup on the air, it has a layer of cold air that gets trapped under a layer of warm air. Normally warm air rises, and then there's another layer of cold air. So there's these layers like lasagna. And because it is pushing down, the cold air is heavy and it's pushing down, and it can't get rid of what's in there. So all this pollution collects. And so Bakersfield, California is actually one of the most polluted places to go to. And LA is another one, but it's not as high as Bakersfield. And then there's Fresno, there's New York. And fortunately for Chicago, Chicago's called the Windy City. So it actually doesn't make the list. So fires, we can actually see, let's see here, yes. You can actually see, if you're in a plane, people burning fires. Now, if you look out, you see all the lights of the cities and the people out in the area, and you see more lights than you actually see people burning. But sometimes you can actually tell that there are campfires and things going on. You can actually see them from a fairly high spot. Another thing of a plant fiber that's being burned is our cigarettes. And of course, we have this big thing, which is Australia on fire. Everybody know about the Australian fires? Look, that is half the size, that smoke trail is half the size of the continent of Australia. Isn't that amazing? And that smoke is dense, and it has a lot of particulate matter and debris and plastics and oils and resins in it, because it is not a clean burn, because it's burning houses and electric lines and treated telephone poles. Nature in and of itself has combustibles that it burns, volcanoes. Everybody remember the Mount St. Helens when it blew? And people were collecting the ash all the way over in New York and grabbing it in bottles and saying, this is Mount St. Helens, this is what's left. If you're at a mineral springs in Utah versus a mineral springs in Georgia, they have, the water is a different color and they actually have a different smell. So if you want a mineral springs that doesn't have a sulfur smell, you need to go out to the west coast and not to the Yellowstone National Park, because those are very sulfury. And then there are geothermal vents. These are some natural things here. And then of course we all know coal, the great smokestacks. And we also now burn a lot of chemicals, and not just our coal, chemicals. One of the things that we do on our plastic factories is to off-gas and set steam. And then I have one here. Anybody here is a friend of cannabis? You realize this is one of the best inventions that Satan has given us recently. There is a distinct pattern to how your brain works when you smoke pot. And it does not go away. It changes the networking of your brain pattern, so it changes it. And it in particularly hits the prefrontal cortex gray matter, the part up here, and a part back here, their temporal gray matter, that processes speech and comprehension. So we know that your frontal gray matter is part of your discernment, your judgment about what is truth, what is real, what you're seeing. It's how you discern reality. And we know that if you drink caffeine, the blood supply shifts from the front part of your brain to the middle part of your brain, which is why you get this pickup of energy. You get zazzed. Well, it's a temporary effect, and it doesn't change the way your brain is wired. It doesn't change its brain's network. Cannabis does, and it seems to be a permanent thing. And this is a study came out in 2015, not that long ago. And some people were using this study to try and prevent recreational marijuana from coming into Colorado. And apparently people don't really care what science says right now, so it didn't work. We all know about oil. We burn it in our cars. We burn it in our frying pans. It burns on oil derricks. You can see pictures of these huge plumes of smog from the oil refineries when they burn, and it can take months to get them to stop burning. But did you know that your air fresheners are built on an oil-based resin? The air fresheners that we use, the fabrics that have fragrances added to them, look at Gain, it advertises specifically that the fragrance is not going to be washed out. And it does that because it's an oil that binds to plastics, polyester, nylon, all of these magic fibers that we have from plastic. And so you have this little microbiome of fragrance that you carry around with you. Unfortunately, that microbiome of fragrance is just like you're sitting out there on that oil derrick. It is oil-based. And oils are not necessarily clean air. There's another oil that might surprise some people. Vaping is not necessarily burning plant fibers. These are chemicals. The material has 10 times the amount of nicotine in it. It has 1/3 the amount of pesticides in it, but it has 16 times the amount of other chemicals that are in it, because this is being synthesized to be concentrated to put into this material. And this study, 2020, it's only a 6-month study, and it's already showing 1.2 times more likely to have lung disease. That is not a long-range study, and it's already showing an impact that has an irreversible damage. So even in my tech geeky magazines like Inverse Today and the Minuteman and some of these other things that are the in thing to read these days, these editors are saying, you should stop vaping. It's bad. If you ever are behind somebody who's vaping and their window's down and they blow out their little plume of smoke, you can see that it is blue-gray. And it actually, in Florida, because we have a lot of humidity, it actually will stay and it will hover right there. It's just a little mini inversion layer, and it just kind of hangs out there. So if you walk through it, you're going to smell like you just vaped. Not so good. So this is my favorite quote out of everything I read. Lungs are meant to breathe air, not polypropylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, nicotine, flavorants, or other stuff. And this guy is one of the chief air researchers at UCLA at San Francisco. And that kind of says it all for me. Unfortunately, we have problems with our indoor air, especially in Florida. We have a problem with our ventilation systems. If you are not keeping ventilation constantly in circulation, your indoor air pollutant levels will rise, and we know this, we test this. The EPA is doing studies on homes, and it does measure the fact that if you're not cycling outside air with inside air, although you think outside air is probably pretty crummy these days, it is actually better than what is inside sometimes, which is kind of an interesting take. We do have studies that are starting all the way back in 2014, and that's when there was a big bump of studies about the impact of our workplace by having not a good ventilation, not good air, because a lot of these office buildings are sealed buildings. We have the technology to do air conditioning. We can control it. We can keep our environment just the way we need it to be. But it costs so much money to do just what it's supposed to be doing that we usually don't run it that way. So we have what they call the incidence of reduced air conditioning, because you turn your temperature up because you don't want it cycling all the time. It starts to accumulate contaminants not only in the air but in your machine. You get sick building syndromes. If you have your house set at 80 degrees, that is too humid and too hot in Florida to keep your building healthy. You will get mold. You will get viruses. You will get bacteria in your air conditioner and your air filters, all of it. And we know that there's a direct correlation to irritability, distress, mental fatigue, productivity. And because it was a little controversial study, I didn't add it in here, but some of the work rage cycles that have been happening in our country, they actually have some of the dirtiest air buildings. The USA has the most polluted cities. I did not believe that. I thought surely it was going to be China, but apparently not. And that's because we have more contained indoor space per capita. I don't know that that data is going to stay up very much longer, but right now it's still one of the cities are polluted. We were the ones who talked about the ozone layer. Now the ozone layer is starting to heal. Has anybody heard that? You know how they took the stuff out of the hairsprays and the air conditioners, and and we're so proud of the fact that our ozone is healing. And you know, it's based on that impact that we now talk about we can make a difference in our climate impact on our future. It comes all from those studies. We do know that God has given us some tools. We have microclimate zones. We do know that trees, for instance, can create a microclimate. Just standing underneath that tree, I could smell when the tree fruit was starting to be ripe. Underneath a tree, actually, under one of these big oaks, the hottest time of the day, in a clear day, it is still cooler by an average of 16% underneath that tree. And when it's cloudy, it's only cooler by about 11%. And this study is done in Asia and in the Netherlands, and they came up with very similar numbers. In China, they looked at trying to make greener cities to deal with some of their difficulty with not having the air patterns to take the pollution out of some areas. So they're doing layered walls of green, vertical walls of green, going all the way up on these 30-story buildings as they're trying to get vegetation as a way to handle some of the air pollution that they have. Actually, China is one of the biggest sources for vertical hydroponics because they actually have been using that technology for longer than we have. And you can find 5-story buildings full of hydroponic growing lettuce and other green leafy things that they actually sell on their first floor to people to eat, all based on chemical processing. However, the studies have shown that trees are not the answer to our air pollution problems. Although it can create a microclimate itself, it suffers. And the older the tree gets, the less it can filter, and the smaller a ring of clean air it keeps underneath it. So our trees too are aging from the impact of sin. In the Bible, there are many, I didn't realize how many, and it actually talks about pollution. And it has a little different look at pollution than what I had thought it was. In Ezekiel, God said that I will give it, talking about Israel, I will give it into the hands of strangers for a prey, and to the wicked of the earth for a spoil, and they shall pollute it. He's talking about the land of Israel being polluted. Ye pollute yourselves with all your idols, even unto this day. That is an interesting take on pollution. Our clean air examples is found in Ezekiel 20. I will accept you with your sweet savor of rest when I bring you out from the people, and I will be sanctified in you before the heathen. This is God talking to the future remnant pieces of our church, or a church, a remnant church in the future. Our smell is not going to be the smell of just typical body odor. We have a smell of rest, of beauty around us that God gives us that we probably don't recognize. And this is not the only verse that suggests this. If you look at the system of burning incense that God gave the Israelites, Aaron shall burn incense every morning when he dresses the lamps, and he shall burn incense on it. And the fragrance around the sanctuary, the tabernacle in the wilderness, spread for miles. So everybody knows that there's a statement that we shouldn't be building a fire on Sabbath. The Israelites were told not to build fires on Sabbath. Well, in the desert, they didn't need them for heat. And they were supposed to be getting ready for Sabbath by cooking the manna the day before. So they didn't really need to make more fire again. But do you think it added a difference to that day where their total focus was supposed to be on God, and they are surrounded by the sweet smell of the fragrance, which was very distinct. There was no other fragrance that they were allowed to make that smelled like the incense they used in the sanctuary. It was unique. And they were under penalty of death not to make the same recipe for any other use. And there are lots of incidences of not so good incense. Because they have forsaken me and have burned incense unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore my wrath shall be kindled out of this place and shall not be quenched. Patriarchs and Prophets writes about the pollution of the air under the trees from all the Israelites burning in the high groves to incense to these gods that they had chosen. And then we have not good at all air. They sacrifice on the tops of mountains, and they burn incense upon the hills and under oaks and poplars and elms, because the shadow thereof is good. So they knew that underneath the tree was a good place to be, but then they weren't doing good things underneath the tree. Therefore your daughters shall commit whoredom, and your spouses shall commit adultery. And as I look at the connection between our air pollution and the rate of anxiety and depression and other difficulties that we have with our psychosocial studies now, I actually think this is more connected than what I used to think. There is good incense, and today we are called to have a good incense. And if we look at Revelation 8, we're told that another angel came and stood at the golden altar, having a golden censer. And there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. So what is the incense that we are to have today? That which we are supposed to do constantly. It's prayer. It actually isn't a smoke. It isn't a plant fiber. It's prayer. And I have a feeling that a lot of our prayers actually can protect us with an atmosphere around us and create a microclimate like Job and Isaiah describe. It's an interesting thing to think about. The incense of Christ's righteousness, which fills with divine fragrance every act of obedience. Did you know that every act of obedience has a fragrance to it? Isn't that an odd thing for God to say? The love of Christ abiding in the soul temple as a sweet fragrance, a savor of righteousness. As they went from house to house, they could converse with the people, carrying with them the fragrance of Christ's life. In thus endeavoring to bless others, they would themselves be blessed. They would obtain an experience in faith. Their knowledge of the Scriptures would greatly increase, and they would be constantly learning how to win souls for Christ. So as we go from door to door in the future, because our neighbors are our mission field, we need to carry the fragrance of Christ's life with us so that they actually can sense that there's something different about that which we tell them. As we acknowledge before God our appreciation of Christ's merits, fragrance is given to our intercessions. I don't think that could be any more clear. I had no idea until I was reading and chasing down all these reference points that fragrance is described as being part of something that we can do, that we can create, that God gives us. And then in Ezekiel 16, if you read the whole chapter, in Christian hygiene, in sanctified living, health reform and sanctification are both considered processes, and they're linked. We are to maintain as healthy an atmosphere around ourselves as we can possibly do, because we are to try and become like Christ. So how do we do that? In many cases, taking out of selected messages, in many cases the attendants of the sick are ignorant of the wants of the body system and the relation in which breathing fresh air sustains to health and the life-destroying influence of inhaling the diseased air of a sick room. So, Ellen White was a big fan of fresh air. And if you had somebody who was sick in a room, you needed to open the window, regardless of the temperature. And they were heating with stove heat, and they had their son in a room that was next to this stovepipe, and he became sick. And an angel came and told her that it was the fumes, the exhaust from that stovepipe that was making her son sick, and they needed to move him out of that room. So it was important enough for an angel to intervene. So that you think she started paying attention to fresh air? I think she did too. We do know if fevers enter a family, often more than one have the same fever. This does not need to be. It is if the habits of the family are correct, if their diet is as it should be, and they observe habits of cleanliness, and they realize the necessity of ventilation, the fever need not extend to another member of the family. And that includes colds, by the way. I've had a cold for almost a month in my house. My husband is just now succumbing. So it is possible to be sick and not have anybody else get sick. You just have to really pay attention. And he probably wouldn't be sick except that he just had surgery done. Fresh air will prove more beneficial to the sick than medicine. Is there any plainer thing than that? And is far more essential to them than their food. So when you're sick, you don't necessarily need food, you need fresh air, you need sunshine, you need water. Air, the precious boon of heaven which all may have, will bless you with its invigorating influence if you will not refuse it entrance. Air must be in constant circulation to be kept pure. How many people leave the fan running in their house? Yeah, I mean, a lot of us don't. We think we can contain our systems and we think we can adjust them. I was reading up on ventilation systems recently, and there's now what's called the smart system. So your air conditioner, when you open a window and you leave it running, it becomes confused because it has little sensors that measure the humidity and the temperature, and then it's got this air pattern in it that it didn't notice before. So they tell you to, if you're going to open the windows, to turn your machine off so you don't confuse it. Well, now, if you have a smart house, your air conditioner will have a sensor on the outside, and it measures humidity and wind directions and particulate matter, and it actually will open your windows for you based on the air is clear, and it will shut itself off. And when the air is no longer as beneficial in your temperature zone and humidity zone you want it in, it will shut the windows and it will turn on this circulation. And all these smart systems, they are continuously running. They are never still. Now they have big blowers that blow to change the temperature, but there's always a small circulation amount going on now. So somebody was paying attention. And another thing that was kind of interesting was many suffer decayed vegetable matter to remain about their premises. They are not awake to the influence of these things. There's constantly arising from these decaying substances an effluvium that is poisoning the air. These are basically trapped gases. Now, how many of you have a compost pile right next to your back door? I don't either, and I have a big compost pile. How many of you turn the fan on when you're cooking in the kitchen? A couple of you do. The smell of your cooking builds up fairly quickly in your house, whether it's in a microwave, on the stove, boiling, doesn't matter, there's an odor there. My daughter's allergic to corn, so she can tell just by walking through, her nose has become very sensitive, exactly what we have for dinner. And of course she walks through and keeps walking most of the time, so it's kind of an interesting thing to watch how God has given her a tool to help her not have a reaction. There's been counsel about our sanitariums. The great medical institutions in our cities called sanitariums do but a small part of the good they might do were they located where the patients could have the advantages of outdoor life. I think this is linked to one of the counsels she gave us about keeping our sanitariums small and numerous, multiple areas. Anybody know what that is? Not small. There's no way we could move that. And because we have gone that route, it has the benefit, what did it say there? A small part of the good that they could be doing. And this is something we've done to ourselves because we've ignored our counsel. So this is a fairly long paragraph, but I just wanted to grab right down to the bottom. All should regard light and air as among heaven's most precious blessings. They should not shut out these blessings as though they were enemies. This one reference point here is she repeats it 117 times in original notes, letters, and articles. And that does not include the references for our compilations. That is a lot of comments that all base on fresh air, ventilation. It's something God gave us. We need to be appreciative of it. And then there's this story that Jim Nix tells. Anybody know who Jim Nix is? He used to be one of the curators for the E.G. White Museum in Battle Creek. And he is a storyteller. And so he has DVDs out of the stories that he would tell. So he would tell the story. It was spring. They were in California. Spring in California is very nice weather usually. And there was a wave of something similar to the flu going through town. And she came and she was invited to do a sermon. And so she's up on the podium and smiling, and she gets up to do her sermon, and she starts, and then she stops and said, I wonder, would one of the deacons please open some of the windows over on this side of the church? Back then we were still building churches with windows, and so they went and they opened just a little bit the windows. And so she did another couple minutes, and then she said, I wonder, that smells so good. I wonder if we could open the windows on this side of the church too. And so then they go and they open the windows up on that side of the church. She hasn't said anything at all about fresh air. She hasn't said anything at all about their fear of being ill, because there was a big fear at that time that if you had all this fresh air, you got cold, you would get sick. And if you got sick and you got pneumonia, you died. I mean, it was not a very good cycle there. So she goes along, and she's about halfway through her sermon, then she says, you know, it would be really nice if we could open up the doors in the back so that we could see out and have extra light. And so they'd open up the doors in the back. And then there were doors in the front, and she had those open too. So by the time she was done with her sermon, the entire building had changed temperature because all the outside air was now inside. And one of the older ladies who was in that church, who out of curiosity kept track of every single person in that church, no one got the flu from around their community that went through. Not a one. Everyone who was sitting in that fresh air in the middle of this mild epidemic did not get sick. Do you think that was God trying to tell them that this really was a truthful thing? So today, we are living very close to the end of time. Jesus is coming soon, and our earth is going to change, and our church is going to change. And we're going to have to carry the atmosphere of heaven with us, wherever it is that God lets us go. So, thoughts for the day. There must be thorough conversions among those who claim to believe the truth, or they will fall in the day of trial. God's people must reach a high standard. They must be a holy nation, a peculiar people, a chosen generation, zealous of good works. Christ has not died for you that you may possess the passions, tastes, and habits of the men of the world. No man enters the portals of glory but he who sets his heart thitherward. Then let the questions come home. Do you mind earthly things? Are your thoughts pure? Are you breathing the atmosphere of heaven? Do you carry with you the miasma of pollution? Are you earnest and devoted, serving God with purity and in the beauty of holiness? Ask sincerely, am I a child of God or am I not? And there is the bottom line of air. We are to carry the fragrance of Christ with us, regardless of what the earth is coming to, right? Anybody have any questions? Yes, sure. You can. The problem with your fan is that it is set at a blower to change the temperature in your house. So it's a lot of air. You're actually, you do not need a big circulation amount. When we moved to Georgia, I was so happy because there was a ceiling fan in almost every room. So you could have a little bit of current going. Well, I thought that was great. And so when I was in college, we did an industrial hygiene, occupational health medicine class. And we would go around and we would measure the chemistry hoods in every single chemistry room where they did the laboratory studies, which, you know, were fairly odorous. And we measured how open the hood has to be with the fan running to actually have it be effective. ventilating the entire room, right? And we discovered that it only has to be open that much. That's not a lot. And there was something about the amount of airflow that fan would pull on that amount. So we went around and they paid me money to go around into every single chemistry lab room and put a little piece of tape right where we had measured on our math studies and say, this is where the hood needs to stay when you're in the room, when you're out of the room. It needs to be right here. So those studies are actually still consistent. If you look at industrial hygiene information today, the amount of circulation it requires is not a lot. So to leave your air conditioner running is expensive. Having a little fan hanging out somewhere, blowing, is keeping it circulating. In Austria, they still do, I guess it's rather German, but they still do the requirement in the college dorm there at Bogenhofen. You must have your dorm room window open for at least 15 minutes every day. And you open it all the way up and you leave it air out for 15 minutes a day. And it's even better if you do it twice a day. And apparently, based on what they have done on studies, that actually gives enough fresh air to be able to clean out that room.
I have major allergies to pine trees and oak trees,
Which means you have to keep your house closed, right?
which means those are the pine trees around my house. My next door neighbors have 3 tall trees. I have 25 pine trees around me, so if I open my windows,
You'll die, yes. So the key is where you're stuck, and this is what God has given us, is to keep air moving inside your house and your air filters clean. You need to be changing your air filter on your air conditioner once a month. And I have come to the impression that if I change my filters out once a month, I can use the cheaper filter rather than the more expensive ones, because I get the same amount of dirt out of it. I take the filters out of my air conditioner and it's just dirt within a month. There are other things you can do to your ventilation system. You can get ultraviolet lights, and you can do full range solar arrays and electrostatic filters and on and on. My daughter, because of her allergies, has air filters in every room that she lives in, and she has to keep it closed because of the oak and the pine around her. And our neighbors are always burning something, which doesn't help me any, because I like my windows open. I have to shut them.
Holly, you're the thing you said is bad in your lungs.
Polypropylene glycol?
Yes, that's the same stuff they give you to drink on a regular basis to keep everything working. I'm so bothered that it's not good. I was inspired because
Well, I think your gut is more tolerant of it being there than your lung cells are.
I don't think it's good there either. I think it's good at sustaining. You put in your eyes, that's in there too.
Yep. And we're using that particular product because it has been approved by the FDA for internal use, so they can use it as the propellant carrier for the different flavorings. So if you want to make your own, I probably shouldn't be saying this online, if you want to make your own, you go and you get a little bottle of laxative and you cook it with the flavor that you want it to be flavored with, whether it's bubblegum or peppermint or whatever, and you cook it in a stove, and then you can add it to your vape mix to make it flavored. Why people want to do that, I don't know. People are stupid. We just are dumb creatures. We have not paid attention to the things God has told us are true, and all of us are confused about some point or another. Fortunately for us, God has tolerance for us, and He is preparing people who are willing to, every time they are shown something, to step forward, because He is preparing a people. And we are told that we are to be preparing to be perfect, to live in heaven, to live in the atmosphere of heaven. And I don't think we realize how important that comment is in these days, because we have to be different. We have to look different. We have to smell different than our neighbor who is stressed out and doesn't understand why America's going to pot. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for your time.